If you were to wander all the way across this center cemetery in Canterbury to the southerly stone wall and then follow the stone wall down over the embankment into a low-lying area, you'll come to a solitary grave nestled beneath the spreading limbs of a large sugar maple. The name and inscription on the small white marble headstone reads simply, Sampson Battis, Heads Company, Reynolds, New Hampshire, Revolutionary War. There's an American flag beside this headstone that further indicates that Sampson Battis was a veteran of the American War for Independence, perhaps better known as the American Revolutionary War. Sampson was born in Canterbury about 1752 and was 23 years old when the Revolutionary War broke out. He was a single man with no family, and he lived on a Canterbury farm owned by a Colonel Archelaus Moore, down in the area where Windswept Farm and the Gilman and Thompson families reside today. Sampson enlisted on April 19, 1775, after hearing about the battles with the British Redcoats at Lexington and Concord. In a local militia regiment under the command of Captain Benjamin Sass, Sampson served for a month during the siege of Boston. He next saw service in September of 1777, when he enlisted again, this time in General John Stark's militia, which was being raised to reinforce the Continental Army at Saratoga, New York. Sampson marched with his regiment to Fort No. 4 in Charlestown, New Hampshire, and then on to Saratoga, New York, where it stayed overnight before moving to nearby Fort Edward. During his service at Fort Edward, Sampson served mostly in the small scouting parties that ranged throughout the area, tracking the movements of the British Army and harassing their supply lines. At Fort Edward, Sampson served with several recognizable figures from history, including General John Stark, Israel Putnam, Paul Revere, and General Benedict Arnold. Sampson was also at this fort in October of 1777, when the fort fell into the invading forces of General Bourlon, who overwhelmed the small garrison with a force of 7,000 British Redcoats that he had marched south from Quebec. Sampson and the defending American Minutemen were forced to retreat back to Saratoga, but just a few short weeks later, the fortunes of war shifted. General Bourlon was repulsed at Saratoga and forced to surrender his now 5,000-man strong army to the American Patriots. A list of American soldiers stationed at Saratoga during this surrender of Bourlon includes the name of one Sampson Battis of Canterbury, New Hampshire. Sampson enlisted for a final term of service in July of 1781. He served under Captain Nathaniel Head and spent part of his time in a forced march to West Point, New York, but the regiment had gotten only as far as Danbury, Connecticut, when they received news that Lord Cornwallis had surrendered to General Washington. The regiment was ordered back to Fort No. 4 in Charleston. Legends exist that suggest that his service may have been above and beyond the call of duty on occasion. One legend tells that the French liaison officer General Marquis de Lafayette, serving as an advisor to General George Washington, was injured in battle and Sampson helped to carry Lafayette from the battlefield. Many years later, in 1825, on a celebratory victory tour of America, General Lafayette returned to Concord and recognized the now aging Sampson in the crowd. Lafayette is said to have called Sampson forward and given him a gift of some $40 as a personal thank you for carrying him from the battlefield. Sampson was also given command of a battalion of state militia in 1800, and with an honorary rank of major, by the New Hampshire Governor John Gilman. This further supports that Sampson had served his country honorably and with distinction. While the story of a notable Canterbury Revolutionary War soldier is remarkable enough by itself,
there is actually much more to the story. You see, Sampson Battis was a Negro slave. He was owned by Colonel Archelaus Moore. Archelaus Moore had volunteered his Negro servant in an effort to help fulfill the quota of men required from Canterbury. Colonel Moore promised Sampson that he would grant him his freedom in exchange for good fighting in the War for Independence. And so, while the American revolutionaries were fighting for freedom and liberty from an oppressive British government, Sampson had a different motive. He was fighting for his own personal liberty and freedom. Colonel Moore kept his word and granted Sampson his freedom from slavery after the war ended. Moore also rewarded Sampson with 100 acres of land bordering the Northfield town line where the Battis family lived for many years. This land was close to the former railroad crossing and is known today as Battis Crossing Road. After the war ended, and upon receiving his freedom from Colonel Moore, Sampson sought out Mr. William Coffin of Boscawen, who owned a slave girl named Lucy. Sampson indentured himself to the Coffin family for the year's hard labor, and at the end of the year he purchased Lucy's freedom and made her his wife. Sampson died at the age of either 86, 100, or 103, depending on which reference you choose to believe. He is buried in the Negro section of the cemetery. Some versions of the legend indicate that he is buried in a lower level of the cemetery because Negroes weren't allowed to be buried in the upper level with the white citizens. Perhaps that is true, perhaps it isn't. Many prefer to believe that spot where he is buried was selected for its peaceful solitude and the shade provided by the maple tree limbs.